This presentation was recorded at the Best Practices for Pollinators Summit. For more information, contact pollinatorfriendly.org.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I am a pollinator ecologist with the Xerces Society. I've got my PhD studying butterflies, specifically the effects of habitat management on butterflies. So it's a topic I love dearly. As I mentioned a few moments ago, I live in north central Oklahoma and typically work in the south central US, but I'm on vacation in northern Florida right now. Okay, want to quickly introduce the Xerces Society, my employer, an international nonprofit that protects the natural world through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. We are named after a beautiful little butterfly that sadly went extinct back in the 1940s. Of course, we want to help prevent extinctions from happening again. We work really hard to try to conserve our invertebrates. Please note that while the Xerces Society is my employer, my main role with them is to be nested within a federal agency, the USDA NRCS. The mission of the NRCS is to deliver conservation solutions so that agricultural producers can protect natural resources and feed a growing world. The NRCS, if you're not very familiar with them, is a colossal agency. The last I heard, they have about 9,000 employees. That means that they have somebody in almost every county of the US. And those folks are there to provide technical assistance, which is advice, high quality advice on how to conserve, but also financial assistance. And again, they're in just about every county. So I'll talk a bit more about them. My role with the Xerces Society is to help NRCS help farmers and ranchers. So today we're talking about the monarch and how to manage habitat for it. Why the monarch? Well, is it because it's so incredibly beautiful? Yeah, that's one of the reasons. And it is an amazingly beautiful butterfly, and it's a fascinating butterfly. And it's probably the most well-known butterfly in America, in North America, if not the whole world. It's quite an iconic species. Its biology is very fascinating. The migration, its chemical defenses, et cetera, et cetera. The other reason why we're talking about the monarch today is because the monarch is in trouble. If we look at a map of the three main monarch populations in the lower 48, we need to recognize that two of those populations are in trouble. Now, the third population that many of you probably don't know about is the South Florida population, which is considered non-migratory. So we don't know much about the status of that population, but there's not a lot of concern about that at this point, to my knowledge. But the other two main populations are the Western population and the Eastern. The Western population breeds in the Western states and into Canada. I need to try to move my toolbar. Let's see if I can, because it's blocking my view of my own slides there. Okay. Yes, the Western population in the summer, spring and summer, it's in the Western states and Southwestern Canada, and it breeds. But then in the fall, they migrate to the Pacific coast, primarily Northern California down to Baja California. How is it doing? Well, the Xerces Society has been leading an effort, primarily a volunteer effort, to assess the abundance of Western monarchs for decades, for I think at least 30 years. And this graph shows the abundance of monarchs since 1997. As you could see, that bar way over on the left for 1997, that year, we counted basically, over 1.2 million monarchs. Since then, it's gone largely downhill. By the way, populations in the 50s and 60s were believed to be millions more. So the Western monarchs are a good deal less abundant than they used to be. In the last 3 years, they've been hovering at a fairly low level. Of course, there was a really nadir in their population 2018, 2019, and 2020. The eastern population are those monarchs that breed in south central Canada, southeastern Canada, the Great Plains, the eastern US, and they overwinter in the mountains of central Mexico, mainly in the state of Michoacan. How is the eastern population? Well, news just came out a week or two ago. The folks with WWF Mexico completed their count of these sites, including El Rosario, which is typically the premier site for monarchs in Mexico and in the world. And I happen to have been there once, and it was one of the greatest experiences of my life because I saw millions and millions of monarchs. But this year, I'm sad to say, was the second worst year for monarchs in the eastern population ever. If we look at this bar graph, each bar is representing not the number of monarchs directly, because that would be impossible to count, but instead it's representing the amount of forest in hectares, the amount of forest that is covered by monarchs. And as you can see, in the 90s, the numbers were quite high. And even in the early 2000s, they were moderate. But since then, they've been generally much, much lower. And as you can see way in the far right, just a few weeks ago, they reported that there were only 0.9 hectares of forest covered by monarchs in Mexico this year, the second worst level ever. Very sad. Okay, so the point of this webinar is to discuss what we can do to manage monarch habitat and to help monarchs recover. And to do that, we have to understand what the habitat is. Good news for monarchs is that they are not habitat specialists. They are habitat generalists, primarily on open habitats, of course. These 8 images all show monarch habitat in various places. In the upper left is some tallgrass prairie in Oklahoma. To the right of that is some oak savanna in Iowa. To the right of that is a cattle pasture in Arkansas. To the right of that, a crop field in Kansas. Down in the lower left, some pine flatwoods in Florida. To the right of that, some marsh in Missouri. To the right of that, salt marsh in the southeast, and then beaches. Yes, monarchs do use beaches as habitat. One common thing about many of these ecosystems, obviously, is that they're pretty open. They're not heavily shaded, but another one is that they need disturbance. Many of them need disturbance to stay that way, especially the prairie, the oak savanna, the pine flatwoods. So another thing to note is that monarchs can occur in any county in the lower 48 states and the southern portions of most Canadian provinces. Therefore, what we discussed today about monarchs is broadly applicable geographically, but also I argue that if we are conserving habitat for monarchs, we are also helping to conserve habitat for a great variety of other species that require open habitat, areas without too much tree cover. For instance, the Orogo skipper, a very rare, beautiful little skipper shown on the left. The Southern Plains bumblebee, which has been proposed for listing as an endangered species. And the regal fritillary, which also has been proposed for listing as endangered species. All of these species prefer habitats that are kept open, just like the monarch does. So as we work to protect the monarch, to conserve habitat for the monarch, and manage it better, that is going to help these other species too. So what are the general types of monarch habitat out there? Well, we've got breeding season habitat, fall migration habitat, and overwintering habitat. And I'm not going to talk much at all today about overwintering habitat. I'll focus pretty heavily on breeding season habitat and then a little bit on fall migration habitat. What happens in breeding season habitat? What behaviors get exhibited? Well, monarchs lay eggs. Of course, there's courtship and mating before there's egg laying, but they also take nectar and they do some roosting. They need to go somewhere at night. So breeding seeds and habitat needs to support all of these essential behaviors. During fall migration, some of the essential activities are nectaring, roosting, but sometimes egg laying too. It is a myth that all monarchs, as they migrate south, do not lay eggs. Some do, usually a small proportion, but it's especially true in my state, Oklahoma, in the states south of us, Texas. As monarchs come migrating through, we have a variety of native milkweeds that are still green and healthy that monarchs utilize and lay their eggs on. And we get additional monarchs produced that can head to Mexico. In fact, monarchs, eggs that were laid on my property in September during fall migration became monarchs that were tagged and then found in monarch overwintering colonies in Mexico. So it's an important phenomenon. The overwintering habitat, the main thing they're doing in the overwintering habitat of California and Mexico is they're sitting there, they're roosting. They are staying in a place that is keeping them at a moderate temperature, not too cold, that would freeze them, not too hot. If it's too hot, then their metabolism is too quick and they live a much shorter life. They're not able to survive the whole winter if conditions are too hot. So again, they do a lot of roosting and they do occasional nectaring. And to a much lesser extent, in some regions, some egg laying too. And the example here is southern Arizona. Few monarchs, some monarchs overwinter in southern Arizona. And yes, there are evergreen milkweeds in southern Arizona that native to southern Arizona that monarchs will lay eggs on. Okay, so breeding habitat. What does it need? It must have milkweed, of course. That's an absolute must because monarch caterpillars are host plant specialists. They feed only on milkweeds. This shows some Danaus eggs laid on milkweeds. I say Danaus eggs because they could have been queen eggs. This photo is taken in Florida where they have queen butterflies as well as monarchs. And you can't tell the eggs apart to my knowledge. But those eggs hatch to become a caterpillar, and that caterpillar must eat milkweed. Eventually, the caterpillar develops into a chrysalis, hangs from a substrate like a leaf. Pupal stage lasts 10 days to 2 weeks. I have heard of very little research or very little concern about the lack of pupation habitat. So I think in anywhere that has enough milkweeds and nectar sources for monarchs is probably going to have plenty of sites for them to pupate. Shoot me an email if you think I'm off base on that. Well, speaking of milkweeds, which are the most important milkweeds? Well, in South Central Canada, Southeastern Canada, North Central US, Northeastern US, this is the most important milkweed. Common milkweed, Asclepias syriaca. This is the one that I grew up with in Western New York. We had it growing in our garden. My dad used to tell me to rip it out, but I didn't because I loved it so much. This plant can form very large clones, and I've seen clones of this plant. It's probably a single genetic individual, but with 1,000 stems. Very important, of course, that it be so abundant to help support a lot of monarch larvae. Another very important species, not as important as a host plant as the previous, but important because it's very widespread, is butterfly milkweed. It occurs in almost every county east of the Rockies. Some studies have shown that monarchs are less likely to lay eggs on it. And I know of such research from Iowa and from Florida. Yet, in my experience, in Iowa, in Oklahoma, in parts of Kansas, if it is the most abundant milkweed in the area or the only milkweed in your area, it often will have monarchs' eggs and larvae. And Great research by Victoria Posius at Iowa State University showed that, yes, monarchs laid fewer eggs on it, but the eggs that hatched on it did wonderfully. They actually performed better in some measures than a bunch of other than larvae that were on a bunch of other native milkweeds. So great milkweed to have. Swamp milkweed, very widespread in the eastern half of the U.S. This is the milkweed of wet areas in the eastern U.S., and it's pretty easy to grow in gardens and somewhat readily available in the nursery trade. I strongly recommend this. Out west, there are a whole bunch of different milkweed species out west. One of the most important is this one, narrow-leaf milkweed, Asclepias fascicularis. And here is another, showy milkweed. This would be probably the most important one of the northwestern portion of the range of the monarch. So southern British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, etc. This species looks a lot like common milkweed from back east, but its petals, look at the petals, look how pointy they are. So the petals are distinct, and then the leaves tend to be a little bit hairier, but quite an important host plant for the monarch. If you're from the desert Southwest, note that you have milkweeds down there too. As a matter of fact, I believe southern Arizona has more species of milkweeds than anywhere in the US, anywhere in North America, that is. And a variety of species. I haven't spent much time down there, so I haven't seen these species yet. Coworkers took these photos for me, but some really beautiful species that monarchs do use. In my neck of the woods, the South Central US, green antelope horn milkweed is fantastically important. It's noted by the very long green petals and the purple hoods on the flowers. This plant is highly toxic, full of cardiac glycosides, so cattle don't eat it. People better not eat it either. It'll make us very sick or even kill us. But the monarchs have evolved, monarch caterpillars have evolved to eat the foliage, incorporate the cardiac glycosides into their tissues, and those cardiac glycosides, which are toxic to vertebrates, help protect the caterpillar, the pupa, and the adult from predators. If you're in the southeastern US, Asclepias fumistrata is a pretty important species called sandhill milkweed. It's a beautiful species with glossy leaves and really neat pink-purple veins on the leaves. Great species for the Southeast. Unfortunately, very difficult to grow. This is not something we can expect to find at nurseries anytime soon. Very difficult to grow. I know somebody growing it, and he says it takes 10 years to get it to flower after you plant the seeds. And that's just not acceptable from a large standpoint. Do want to point out that it's not just Asclepias. We have other native milkweed genera used by monarchs. Now, none of these are in Canada, to my knowledge. And I don't think they're in Minnesota either. But south of Minnesota is the genus Synancum levy, which is a native species that monarch larvae do wonderfully on. In the south central and southeastern US, we have the genus Matalea, which is a milkweed vine. And then 3 other milkweed vines are Gonalobus, Unastrum, and Petalius. And I have seen monarch larvae on all of these genera, and I've reared them out on it, and they're all important in their own way. So which milkweeds do monarchs use and which do they not use? If you want to learn more about that, there's an excellent paper by Louis Greenstein et al., published 2 years ago. And I'll spend a little time on this slide so you can take a picture of that citation if you want to read it. I had the pleasure of speaking to Louis, who was an undergrad at the time when he wrote this paper. I talked to Louis and his advisor, and it's a wonderful review of the literature to figure out which milkweed species are being used and which aren't. And as you can see, they identified 34 high-performance milkweeds, 42 species on which monarchs were using, but they didn't do fantastic on them. And they identified 33 non-hosts 18 species with unsubstantiated claims. But I will argue that even those 33 non-hosts, it is not definitive that monarchs will not use those species. It's just the data are such that there's a little bit of data indicating, well, maybe monarchs don't, but it's not solely clear that monarchs won't use those species. So we do need a lot more research on milkweeds, basic science research on which milkweeds monarchs use and which ones they prefer, and what are the differences in performance of the larvae that feed on the various milkweed species. Okay, now we got to talk about nectar plants. Breeding habitat often almost always has nectar plants as well. I'm going to throw in a strange curveball, and that is to ask the question, how important are nectar plants during the breeding season? What happens if the nectar plants are eliminated? I am not aware of any research that addresses this. If you are, please shoot me an email. I'll have my email address up multiple times during this talk. But I'm not aware of much research on this yet. How important are the nectar plants in the spring, in the summer? I will say that it is my assumption that they are extremely important. And with my own eyes, I have seen thousands of monarchs nectaring on dozens and dozens of species. It's a great passion of mine. But it is interesting to think that we haven't even done the basic science yet, to my knowledge, to determine how essential are nectar plants at various times of the year. We do know that they're extremely important in the fall. I'll mention that in a minute. So my working assumption is nectar plants are very important in spring and summer. And to that effect, I am the manager of the Xerces Society's Monarch Nectar Plant database. And this is just a screenshot of part of that database, in which we collect observations of monarch nectaring events from all over North America. We will have data from Canada. We don't have any yet, but we will have it soon. Lots of data from the US and some data from Mexico. In the central US, we have more data than on nectaring than any other part of the country. A few of the native nectar sources that are preferred are native thistles, butterfly milkweed, wild bergamot, also known as Monarch fistulosa, and over on the right, buttonbush. But I'll point out that in other regions of the country, we have much fewer data. We have very few data from California, even fewer data from the other Western states. We have, I think, no data from Canada yet, I apologize to say. It's more my fault than the fault of the Canadians. We have very few data from the Southwestern US or the Southeast. Wherever you are from in North America, we would very much welcome your data. So, if you have seen monarchs nectaring on native plants, please photograph this QR code. It will take you to a website in which you can enter some monarch nectar observations into our database. It takes about 5 minutes to enter an observation, and it really contributes a lot because, again, assuming that nectar plants are really, really important, and I do assume that, we need to know what they're using in each portion of the range so that we can ensure that our management activities are providing nectar plants throughout the range. So again, please take a photo of this QR code. It'll take you to a website. Bookmark that website if you can, so that you can enter data into this database in the future. Here's a screenshot of the portal. It's, I think, pretty easy to enter those data. Again, it takes about 5 minutes. Or if you don't want to do that, consider emailing me at this address. Okay, what about fall migration? How important is nectar then? There is research indicating very clearly that lots of nectar, monarchs need a lot of nectar in the fall. Why? They need it to build up their fat resources so that they can survive the winter. It's not as important for the flight to Mexico or the flight to California, where they really need the nectar. They nectar during that period, but they're really building up fat reserves by consuming a lot of nectar so that they can survive the winter. Because once they get down to Michoacan, Mexico, there aren't anywhere near enough flowers to feed them. And that was proven by research by my good buddy Alfonso Alonso down in Mexico back in the 1990s. So anywhere where you are in the range of the monarch, put a special emphasis on having lots of nectar plants available for monarchs in the fall. During fall migration, monarchs also roost quite often. Often in trees. If you are in parts of the world where there are very few trees, that's where you can find the largest roosts. 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 monarchs all clustered together in a few trees. And I speculate that this is because when there are very few trees available, the monarchs take what they can get and they congregate. If you're in a region with a lot of forest already, I believe, but haven't seen proof, that monarchs spread out amongst the trees and you have small roosts in a variety of trees. Here's a provocative question. Should we leave some trees in the grasslands to ensure that monarchs can roost in them? Well, if you live in the grasslands and you have a tree that monarchs already roost at, I'm not going to tell you to cut that down because it's a very special phenomenon to have a tree that frequently gets lots of monarchs. But we do have to think of the other resources out there in the grasslands, the prairie chickens, for instance, which typically abandon areas of grasslands if there's too much vertical structure like trees or telephone poles. So at this point, it's not clear to me how necessary trees are during the fall migration. Will they roost in tall wildflowers if there are no trees available? Quite possible. Some of you may know the answer to that. If you do, please email me at that. But provocative question. My emphasis, I think it's so important that we restore grasslands to grasslands that I'm not going to promote the planting of trees in grasslands. That's for sure. Now let's talk about the nitty-gritty of the talk, how to manage habitat. Prescribed fire can be a terrific tool. And it's one that I've employed. I've been on about 80 or 90 burns. And it's exciting work. And it's exceptionally important work for maintaining open habitat, sunny ecosystems in North America. Some research has been done. This is a study that should have been published years ago. It's my fault that it wasn't, in which my colleagues, Diane Dubinsky and Nick Lyons and others, found that dormant season fire increases the abundance of butterfly milkweed, Scupius tuberosa. I believe there are also studies showing the same with milkweeds in Oklahoma. And it is my default assumption that most of our native milkweeds will be benefited by prescribed fire if it's conducted at the right time. There's a significant amount of research out there indicating that fire can stimulate and increase the availability of nectar resources. A study that I performed in Missouri about 15 years ago, published a while later, showed that two of the great nectar plants for monarchs, pale purple coneflower and tall blazing star, were far, far more abundant a few months after a burn than they were years later. As more and more time elapsed after a burn, the prairies that I studied became more and more choked with live grass and dead grass, and there wasn't enough sun available for the wildflowers. So yeah, these sites were both truly spectacular places to be. A few months after a fire, there were wildflowers galore and pollinators galore. How does fire affect monarchs specifically? Anne Swengel in '96 found that monarchs were more abundant in recently burned prairie in the upper Midwest. I found the same thing in southern Iowa and northern Missouri. Leone et al. Found this similar thing, I believe, in the north central states. It was more abundant in burned prairie than grazed prairie. So overall, fire is having a pretty positive effect on monarchs. One reason why, one thing that's important, is a great amount of the fire that is conducted, the prescribed fires that are performed in the central US at least, are performed in winter. Where are monarchs in the winter? They're not in the central US. They're not vulnerable to fire. They're in Mexico during the winter. So the burning that one does in the winter is improving the habitat without causing any mortality of monarchs. It is causing mortality of some other native pollinators. So that is something very important to consider. How about livestock grazing? Well, livestock grazing can be an important threat to pollinators, including monarchs, when there is chronic overutilization. This is a cattle pasture that I saw in South Central Texas, I'll call it, a couple years ago. And the cattle were stocked so heavily that they grazed all the plants down to about, well, less than a half an inch, it looks like. Another site, they grazed it so severely that there was not enough vegetation to hold the soil, and we got this site has massive soil erosion. Now that's clearly not just bad for monarchs, that's bad for native ecosystems in general, and that's that's going to be bad for the watershed, which is going to be getting full of soil particles, and it's bad for the rancher because the rancher, he or she, will have less forage for their livestock. So the solution, the general solution, is prescribed grazing. Grazing in a manner that is well thought out to provide long periods of rest, which will allow the wildflowers to recover. And this photo is from northern Oklahoma. The large creatures in the background are bison, not cattle, but the same principles apply whether it's bison or cattle. There need to be long periods of rest. Even if you have bison really heavily stocked in a native prairie for a long time, chronically, the bison will overgraze it as well. So it's very important to provide long periods of rest. One way to do that is rotating cattle from one pasture to another. But I argue that rotation should not be rapid. If the cattle get returned to an area where they've heavily grazed, if they get returned within 30 days or even 60 days, that's not a long enough period of rest in my experience. But we do need more research on this topic. The effects of grazing on monarchs, on other pollinators, and the resources they use is a topic that is in great need of further study. This is another site with prescribed grazing. This site is grazed by cattle, and yet it is full of wildflowers. The main thing this rancher does is rotate the cattle off of this portion to a different part of his property for part of the year, giving a chance for the plants to recover. A very beautiful place. This is Oklahoma. One way we can ensure that the cattle are distributed better so that there's rest is to integrate fire and grazing. This is through the practice known as patch burn grazing. Patch burn grazing helps to mimic the natural phenomenon of pyrrhic herbivory. That term was coined by Sam Fuhlendorf at Oklahoma State University a few years ago, who was my mentor, one of my mentors. And the point with pyrrhic herbivory is that when you burn an area, new vegetation comes up. That new vegetation is fresher and more nutritious. So the livestock go to that area to consume that new vegetation. When they consume it, that stimulates the vegetation to put up more fresh vegetation. So the livestock will stay there for weeks, if not months, in one part of a pasture, focusing all their efforts. That means that the other parts of the pasture have rest. The other parts of the pasture, the wildflowers are coming up and blooming and not being consumed. So patch burn grazing can be a great practice. And this is a diagram that shows a classic patch burn grazing regime in the central US. In this diagram, you've got cattle, you've got a single pasture, but rather than burning the entire pasture, the rancher burned one part of the ranch 2 years ago, 1/3 of the ranch last year, and 1/3 of the ranch this year. Where do the cattle go? Most of them go to the portion that was grazed this year, meaning that the other two sections, last year's burn and burn 2 years ago, those areas are getting rest. And those will be the better areas for monarch habitat in a given year. And this is an example of patch burn grazed habitat from southern Iowa. The site had a good number of monarchs as well as regal fritillaries and pollinators in general. What about haying? The cutting of grasslands for and then baling it for sale as forage to livestock. What about haying? Can that be compatible with monarch conservation and the conservation of other pollinators? It most certainly can. This is a hay meadow in Anderson County, Kansas, where I did some research. This hay meadow had monarchs, regal fritillaries, and Orogo skippers. It is hayed every year, but only once per year. It is a very beautiful site. I've been told, but have not gone to them to see, that there are hay meadows in Czechia, in Central Europe, formerly Czech Republic, Czechia, hay meadows that have been cut annually since the 1300s. And those are some of the most biodiverse places in Europe. So hay meadows can be terrific for biodiversity. One way to learn more about them is this fantastic document written by Kelly Kincher and don't know the first name of Baczynski, these folks with the Kansas Biological Survey. And one of their main recommendations is that a single cutting per year is best. Multiple cuttings means the plants aren't getting enough time to recover. Also means that you're causing more mortality, because yes, when you do have machinery in there and you're cutting, you will be, if there are monarch eggs, larvae, and pupae in there, you'll be killing some. So ideally, raise the cutting height a little bit to reduce that. And as I mentioned at the bottom, the hope is that hay cutting is timed just right so that the positive impact on habitat will outweigh the negative impact of direct mortality to monarchs. Because again, when a machine's out in a hay meadow, it cuts the hay and puts it into bales, a bunch of insects are getting killed. There's no way to avoid that. But if you time it a certain way, you can reduce the impact on certain species. And here is a guideline. Here's a document, and I wish I'd provided the link to this document, but I failed to. So consider taking a photo if you're interested in this topic. Consider taking a photo of this slide and then searching for this document online. It's readily available. Timing the management for monarch breeding habitat out west. And in it, this document has this excellent map showing, giving you advice on when you should manage so that you're not impacting monarchs during the breeding season. And for example, if you manage land in the Central Valley of California, which is indicated in light blue, as well as Central Coast of California, conduct your habitat management activities between October 31st and March 15th, as monarchs are unlikely to be breeding during that period. Now, again, this is just applying to breeding habitat, not to the overwintering sites on the coast. But if you own land north of Sacramento and you want to do some burning or do some hay cutting, consider doing it basically in the winter, because the monarchs are not on your land in the winter. They're at the overwintering colonies on the coast. And obviously, looking at the map, the different colors indicate different periods for the various parts of the Western US. There is a similar document for those of you east of the Great Divide at the Monarch Joint Venture website titled Mowing and Management, Best Practices for Monarchs. And for example, if you manage land in northern Minnesota, which is indicated on this map in light green, try to conduct your habitat management activities in the late fall, winter, and early spring, when monarchs aren't in northern Minnesota. Importantly, if you want to cut hay in northern Minnesota and you're desperate to do it in midsummer, this map also suggests that you could do that. It provides a very narrow window when that might be more amenable to monarch conservation, and that window is between June 30th and July 5th. Obviously, if you are in Oklahoma or Texas or Florida, the timing for these activities changes. And that is this an excellent document to give you advice on when to manage. I took this photo last year or the year before in Osage County, Oklahoma, which of course is the site of the Osage Reservation, great Native American people. And what we're looking at is part of a ranch that's about 100,000 acres. This ranch was once great monarch habitat, and it's still native grassland. But if you look carefully, there's something very important missing. There are no wildflowers whatsoever, because the rancher sprays the entire ranch with herbicides to kill all wildflowers. Believe it or not, there are plenty of ranchers in the central US that do this. So ultimately, educating folks not to do that, teaching folks, asking folks, begging folks not to do that is important, because this 100,000 acre site could be amazing habitat for monarchs, regal fritillaries, Orogo skippers. But when there are no flowers, no milkweeds, it's almost worthless to our pollinators. It is worthless. Chemical weed control BMPs. Please don't spray your native forbs. Livestock eat many forbs because they are nutritious. Many of you probably saw yesterday's webinar by my colleagues Ray Powers and Sarah Hamilton Buxton, titled Understanding Wildflower Forage Value, in which they and our supervisor Jennifer Hopwood discovered that many of the wildflowers that ranchers don't appreciate are actually more nutritious than grass. Milkweeds actually have very high protein content, and some of the milkweeds have very little poison. So research has come out showing that common milkweed, for instance, is sometimes preferred by livestock over grass because it's highly nutritious, and yet it doesn't have a lot of the cardiac glycosides. The species that live in Oklahoma are more toxic, but up north, common milkweed, showy milkweed, not as toxic, and do get consumed by livestock. If you do use chemical weed control to kill exotic species that are taking over the landscape, like Xerces lespedeza in my region, kudzu in the southeast, definitely avoid broadcast applications. Spot spray when you can, and then follow label directions. So I will go through a couple quick case studies and then finish up. Eastern red cedars are taking over much of the central United States, including my farm a few years ago. Underneath those eastern red cedars it is highly barren, no milkweeds, no nectar sources. So I got some money, bought some chainsaws, got some help, and started cutting trees down, but realized that wasn't enough. So I hired people to come in with heavy machinery to cut down the cedars and restore open grassland. I also conducted prescribed fire, and what we got is a lot of open habitat loaded with wildflowers with a lot of pollinators, including monarchs. We also have more birds than ever before, including northern bobwhite. We were told we would never get them on our property, but we've had a covey of about 9 quail on our land since last summer, and it's extremely rewarding to see that. They are adorable. Another case study from Oklahoma. Bruce Reynolds in southern Oklahoma has a 1,700-acre ranch invaded by cedars. The NRCS, this very important federal agency, helped fund brush management. Once again, heavy machinery to bulldoze, basically, cedars. And then they helped to fund prescribed burning to burn the dead cedars up. And what they got was gorgeous rangeland, which is full of nutritious grass and wildflowers for cattle and for monarchs. A great success, funded by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Your American tax dollars being put to great use, in my opinion. Lots of milkweeds and nectar sources on that ranch. How can you learn more about monarchs and their habitat? Well, at the Xerces Society, we published a book on 100 plants to feed the monarch. Talks about 34 native milkweeds and 66 native nectar plant genera. We have roadside milkweed guides for every region of the lower 48 states. I apologize to folks from Canada that we don't have publications like this from Canada, nor do we have publications like this from Mexico. I have heard talk recently that we are going to get more into this kind of work for Mexico, because northern Mexico is really important for monarchs and monarch migration. We produce monarch nectar plant lists for the lower 48 states. Those are available. There is a link to that at the summit website. We also have 2 documents for the Western U.S. that focus on managing habitat in the Western U.S. I know I've talked a lot about the Central U.S. That's where I live and work. But if you want to learn more about best management for the West, you can hit these documents, which are excellent and free online. If you want to learn more about range management in the Great Plains, there is a link to this document on the Summit website. How can you get financial assistance in the US to manage habitat? Well, obviously, the USDA NRCS is one possibility. If you own land, or you have friends or family who own land, and you want to get in contact with the NRCS to seek technical and financial assistance, search USDA Service Center. Once you get to that website and you see this map, click on your state. If you click on Oregon, for instance, it'll give you a map of Oregon. Click on your county. If you live in Lynn County, Oregon, it'll give you the contact information for NRCS in that county. Obviously, this applies to every other county in the US. Takeaway messages of this talk. Managing monarch habitat can help many other species. I want you to try, I think we all need to try to mimic natural disturbance regimes where possible, with fire, with grazing in a manner that is similar to what the bison did. Let's see. Scroll to the next. Don't know why. There we go. And I want to point out that restoring and managing habitat can greatly beautify the landscape. I want to thank Lori Schneider, of course, and Karen Jokula of Xerces for inviting me to deliver this webinar. I want to acknowledge the supporters of Xerces. Most importantly are the members of the Xerces Society. We couldn't do what we do without members. So please consider joining the movement. The work we do depends on y'all. Please consider becoming a Xerces member today at xerces.org/donate.